Okay, now let's begin with some of the paradigms. I call this the inventory of paradigms. How do we think about the origins of Islamic law? What are the ideas that we have? Well, let's just begin with some basics that are very important. First of all, none of the schools had a founder as such. Abu Hanifa did not found a Hanafi school. Malik did not found a Maliki school. He didn't have a charter that was signed. He didn't call his disciples around him. Not a single one of the Imams, whether they were Sunni or Shi'i, regarded himself as a founder. All of them regarded themselves as transmitters and as embodiments of tradition. This is really important because obviously one of the questions which arises is the question of how did the schools come to be? How did Malik become the center of the Malik school, of the Medinan school, and not, for example, somebody else? Malik, of course, is great, but there were people before him that were equal in stature. There were people after him who were also very great. So how does it come to focus on him? He didn't gather the people around himself and say, follow me. On the contrary, Imam Malik, who had tremendous authority, he had an aura of authority that nobody in his generation had. But he was himself very humble. And he would even say that I'm not very good at this. Giving legal judgments, something I don't do well. So he always played himself down. But he became the authority. So the schools were not founded by their founders. The people that their eponyms, as we say, the people that they are attributed to, they were founded by disciples. They were founded by men and women of later generations. So this is really important. None of the schools has a charter. Okay, so you can't really date when did the Maliki school begin. And you can't say that, well, the Hanafi school is older because Abu Hanifa is, 10 years older than Imam Malik. It doesn't work like that because Abu Hanifa was the heir of a tradition. And Malik was the heir of a tradition. And this can be said about every one of the Imams. And they simply become the epitome of that tradition. Another thing is that the Islamic schools of law were not codes of law. We said last time when we talked about schools of law that every school of law is, a body of doctrine. And that body of doctrine has consistency. Certain opinions that come out of it are predictable. But it's not a code of law. And the idea of Islamic schools of law, or of Islamic law as a code of law, that's a very modern idea. And it's an idea that comes from exposure to whom? Who would you think? Who is it that has codes of law? Western Europe. But not the United States. And not Great Britain, because we don't have codes of law. We have common law. We have common law traditions. Our law in England and in America is much more like Islamic law in that it's really a process. It's a process and it's precedence. It's not like a code, like the Napoleonic Code or some imperial code of the past. But all of the schools are really a process. And this is something that we need to emphasize when we look at the schools, because even though we'll talk about things that pertain to the origins of the school, the history of the schools, and so forth, in the end, probably for you, especially for most Muslims that would come to a class like this, probably the thing that you'll be most interested in is the process. Especially as that process manifests itself in certain principles of deduction. The way that we use our minds, the way that we look at hadith, the way that we look at analogy, the rationality that can be allowed or can't be allowed. Okay, so these processes are very important for us. And I think they're very instructive for us today, even if we're not talking about a particular ruling or a particular decision that was made. Okay, now, how did the content of Islam come to be passed from one generation to another? How was the content of the revelation that was given the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed to Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, the others, and then passed to the successors, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib and Urwa ibn al-Zubayr and so forth, and then passed to the successors of the successors, and coming down to you right now. How did that happen? Well, most Muslims would say by texts. By texts. What were those texts? Well, Quran. Okay, oral text would be Quran and Hadith. Okay, and, excuse me, Seerah usually doesn't come in, but the text. In other words, the law was transmitted by Hadith, right? It's the Quran which is revealed. You read the Quran, it tells you to pray. You look to the Hadith, you learn how to pray, right? Isn't that the way that most of us do it? Is that the way that Abu Bakr learned Islam? Is that the way that the teachers of Imam Malik learned Islam? Oral transmission, meaning that they heard the Hadith, right? But still it was a Hadith. Still it was a Quranic verse. So what's the difference? The difference is just that it was written down later on, right? Okay, this is the textual idea. So, for example, according to the textual theory of origins, a difference of opinion between Malik and between Abu Hanifa and between, let's say, a Shafi'i is maybe because he didn't hear the Hadith, or the Hadith wasn't strong in his mind, or this one heard another Hadith. Okay, is that a legitimate understanding of the origins of Islamic law? Many people hold that view. In any case, this idea of the textual transmission of the law, this became the dominant paradigm. Okay, that became the dominant paradigm among Muslims and among a lot of non-Muslims. Okay, it became the dominant paradigm. So, for example, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, the great philosopher, and he was also a great judge and a great legal thinker, he wrote a book called Bidayat al-Mujtahid, which means the beginning of the jurisprudent, where you begin if you want to be a great legal scholar. How many of you know that book? Bidayat al-Mujtahid. Okay, this is a great book, but Ibn Rushd, who's living hundreds of years later in Spain, basically he follows the textual theory. In other words, what are the texts? How do we understand the texts? How would we interpret this hadith from a Maliki standpoint or a Hanafi standpoint, and so forth? Now, what we're going to talk about tonight, which is much more central to the way the Maliki school developed, and probably law schools in general, is practice. In other words, there were always human beings in the process who were living embodiments of what was being transmitted, who had mastered that, and who embodied it in every way. So that just to be with them, just to be around them, was to get the whole picture. And of course the first person would be the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That the Prophet is a complete human being. From our point of view, theologically, a perfect human being. And he embodies human perfection. And although he teaches you how to pray, and how to make ablutions before you pray, and how to wash, and how to buy and sell, and how to do other things, you get the whole picture from being with him. Because you are, after all, companions, men and women. So Islam is a living reality. It's not a disembodied text. It's not a disembodied text. You know, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't a phonograph, or he wasn't a radio. He wasn't a mouthpiece only. He was a living human being. And he kept around him his companions 23 years. 2 full decades and more. This is really important. And then, how did his companions transmit the message to the people after them? The same way. So always you have not the transmission of isolated, disembodied texts, but you have the transmission of a living existential reality. And because that's the case, there may be many things that don't have to be said, that can be left unspoken. Okay? So this, in fact, will be one of the greatest debates of all in Islamic legal theory. That what is the relationship of the text when it's disembodied? Such as it would be for you and me today if we go to Tirmidhi, or we go to Muslim, or we go to another source of hadith, and we just take a hadith. That's a disembodied hadith. We don't know if it was from Mecca or from Medina. We don't know if it's early or late. We may not even know what it means, even though we know the Arabic perfectly. But we may not even understand what it's about. It's just like if I brought you right now, let's say 100 photographs from your trip to Turkey last summer. Let's say that you went with us to Turkey last summer. We brought